Hey, I'm back. Sorry, I was busy drinking on my porch for 3 months. For some reason, my recording software loves to do this thing where it like has VHS lines that work its way down. We're gonna pretend that's an aesthetic choice if it happens, because I don't know how to fix it. And I came back to talk about Steven Crowder. Yes, I know every other even vaguely leftist channel you follow has done at least one video debunking Steven Crowder. Yes, I know he's an entertainer who adopts the aesthetics of empiricism to prevent his audience from thinking too hard. And yes, I know that means hitting him with facts and logic is treating that aesthetic with a sincerity it does not deserve. But he is wrong, and you're already here, so might as well keep going. On October 17th, Crowder and Company streamed a rebuttal on their YouTube channel that set out to debunk a segment from John Oliver's HBO show Last Week Tonight on trans rights that aired the night before. My video is just responding to Crowder's video about John's video. I do not have the mental fortitude to sit through and critique and analyze hours upon hours of his content. And even if I did, Jose did a better job than I would have, so just watch his video if you want an overall look, because I gotta come clean, I've never actually watched a full Steven Crowder video before, so I've never experienced firsthand what his show is like to watch. Technically, I still haven't, because I skipped the first 15 minutes or so where they're talking about Kanye buying Parler or whatever to focus on the John Oliver rebuttal. And the way that segment starts is overwhelming. Before talking about anything John Oliver said, Crowder inoculates his audience against any slight chance they might be persuaded by what they're about to hear from him.
So I want you to keep in mind empirical versus anecdotal and the idea of gaslighting, because we are dealing with narcissists. We are dealing with people who believe that whatever makes them feel good, and largely that's praise of their constituents, must be right. Makes me feel good. It's about how I feel, and they falsely equate that with happiness. And narcissists seek control, and narcissists seek to make you think that you are crazy, so that way all of their behavior is permissible and no one actually calls them to the mat. So let's keep that in mind with John Oliver as we go through this point by point.
Don't worry, all the facts are on our side. They just want to gaslight you. Their happiness is fake because only we know what true happiness is, and they are just narcissists who want to trick you in order to control you so they can, I don't know what they think comes after that. It doesn't have to make sense. It's about priming the audience to close their minds as much as possible. If they bring up a study showing the benefits of transitioning, it can't be real science. If a trans kid says they're happy, it's not real happiness. Plus, it's just an anecdote. And since they are narcissists, they can't actually care about the well-being of kids. So it's up to you, the thoughtful and discerning member of Steven Crowder's audience. I used the word inoculate earlier because there's a theory in social science called inoculation theory. It's based on the notion that just like a vaccine can prepare your body for a disease by exposing you to a weakened version of it, you can make an argument weaker by either refuting it before exposure, pre-bunking, or developing a strategy to view the argument in the least charitable light. It's the one type of vaccine Steven Crowder believes in. Ironically, there are several studies showing that attitudinal inoculation can be pretty effective at preventing radicalization into extremist and hateful ideologies, but it stands to reason that a strategy that keeps you from being persuaded by bad ideas would also keep you from being persuaded by good ones. Okay, now that I've set the stage by showing how Crowder sets the stage, let's get started debunking Steven Crowder, who is debunking John Oliver, who is debunking fears about trans people, and this is how we're gonna spend our time on Earth, just like this. Crowder starts his self-described point-by-point breakdown of John Oliver's segment by, of course, preempting it like this.
So here's a claim that he makes right now about anti-trans bills to try and set it up as though you're an extremist. Let's go.
It is clearly more than just bad jokes. This year alone, over 100 anti-trans bills have been introduced in state houses, and 12 states have signed or enacted them, with all of this happening against a backdrop of violence and threats, including attacks and harassment aimed at hospitals providing gender-affirming care to youth.
Okay, so that's the claim. Let's get to the truth here. Again, the empirical. He just says 12 states. So let's look at some of these so-called anti-trans bills. All of our references are available, link in the description.
So John lays out the fact that over 100 anti-trans bills have been introduced in state houses this year alone. Crowder rebuts this by saying that the empirical truth of the matter is that the bills aren't in fact anti-trans. His defense for this truth is to say that a bill to prevent trans minors from accessing gender affirmative care, a bill to prevent trans girls from playing in girls' sports, and a bill to prevent trans kids from using the correct bathroom somehow aren't anti-trans. He explicitly says that these bills were introduced as a reaction to and negation of trans policies.
The reasons they need to create a bill that he says is an anti-trans bill, which specifically bans the use of puberty-blocking drugs on minors and surgical interventions. That's the anti-trans bill. Yeah. Remember, we went from Target won't let them take a shit in the bathroom they want, and it's just like the pre-civil rights era. Now it's you can't give puberty blockers or cut off a penis of a 6, 7, 15-year-old. It's an anti-trans bill, and the governor tried to veto it, which shows you the reason for the bill in the first place.
So yeah, this isn't a rebuttal. This is just Crowder agreeing with these anti-trans bills. But I want to highlight something from that last point. You can't cut off the penis of a 6, 7, 15-year-old. I don't think I have to tell you that 6 and 7-year-olds aren't getting genital surgeries, and never were. And I wasn't able to find any evidence of a 15-year-old ever getting one either. If that evidence existed, Crowder would have pounced on it. This is intentional. He wants to prime his audience to think as young as possible when trans minors are brought up. He'll never use teenager or adolescent when child could work. He'll never let you think 17 when you could be imagining 7. My proof of this is going to come a little later, but trust me, it'll be obvious when it does. The next point Crowder wants to debunk is, once again, preempted by his emotionally accusing John Oliver of exploiting a child in order to appeal to emotion.
And so here's a case in point, the next claim. He goes on to accuse conservatives of demagoguing and sort of appealing to emotion. And then John Oliver immediately uses, and I mean uses, exploits a child to appeal to your emotion in the absence of the empirical.
Let's also remember that it's not actually the left talking about trans rights non-stop. It's Republicans who see an advantage in demagoguing this issue. A few years ago, Vice profiled a girl named Kai Shapley, and just watch how happy she is talking about her hopes for a future until she remembers something that changes her.
And this has not been scripted or this girl coached.
I might grow up to be the president.
Yeah? What would you change about the world if you were president?
Let trans people be free and go to the bathroom they want to go to.
Are you able to use the girls' bathroom at school?
No. And now they just put security guards up for the bathroom security or whatever.
That is brutal. It is so dark, it's genuinely hard to watch.
Let me change one thing here before we get to the truth.
Well, I do agree with that part.
Yes, it is very, yes.
Yeah.
Let me change one thing before we get to the truth here. Ask that child about anything else regarding policy if they were president, and would you take it seriously? I would make it so that we could use any bathroom we want. And John Oliver takes it as legitimate. If you ask them about foreign policy, if you ask them about immigration policy, they'd be like, well, I don't know anything. They're a kid. Kids are stupid.
So I think the claim of John's that Crowder is trying to debunk is John accusing Republicans of demagoguing the trans issue. And, he uses a little girl who's sad about not being able to go to the right bathroom as an emotional appeal. Crowder and company respond to this by saying that the boy who transitioned to a girl was coached in that interview and making fun of the idea that we would listen to the foreign policy positions of a child president because children are stupid. That's not actually debunking anything. But I guess that's supposed to be when he shows the truth about outcomes for transgender children, where he posts that the desistance rate, that is the rate of children ceasing to identify as transgender, is 65 to 94%, which isn't related to what John was talking about in the clip he's supposed to be debunking, but whatever, we finally see mention of studies and science, so I get to engage with this point on my home turf.
So here's the truth, by the way, too, the empirical. Here are some of the statistics on child outcomes. For decades, there have been follow-up studies of transgender children. They've shown that a substantial majority, anywhere from 65 on the low end to 94%, eventually completely cease to identify as transgender.
Wow.
And oh my God, to hear Steven Crowder wax poetic for the past 10 minutes about how science has been abandoned by them, and he cites his sources and cares about facts, and he's empirical and they're anecdotal. For him to fuck up his first source this bad, first off, there is a blatant lie on this screen. As of time of writing, which is October 19th, and as of time of recording, which is October 21st, this source is not listed either in the description for the video or the link to the show notes and sources in that description. If that seems pedantic, his source is posted on a screen with the caption, "All sources available in the description and louderwithcrowder.com" directly beneath it. But we do have a title and a source, and I was able to track down the article, of which he only shows 2 lines that he's highlighted for some reason. The article's called "The Controversial Research on Desistance in Transgender Youth." Does that title raise any red flags? It should have for Crowder's team, because the sentence he shows is the second in an article dedicated to questioning the accuracy and validity of that statistic. If you're going to make this claim, why would you pick an article that interviewed the lead author of one of the main studies used to support this statistic, saying that you should not use his study to support this statistic? Empirical data! Despite liquefying his own foundation, he uses this statistic to make this bizarre extrapolation.
Okay, anywhere from 65 on the low end to 94% eventually completely cease to identify as transgender. Wow. Okay. And if you don't if you don't intervene, they all grow out of it. If you do intervene, that number goes down to, some studies show as low as 0%.
Even if this statistic were true, and I now have an article that questions if it is, how could you justify saying that 65 to 94% is basically 100%? It gets even better. That article doesn't source where they're getting the 65 to 94% statistic either. My best guess is that it comes loosely from a list of 11 studies compiled by pedophile advocate James Cantor. His list includes the one from the author we just mentioned, as well as 7 studies conducted prior to 1987, many of which involved parents and clinicians actively trying to correct gender-inappropriate behavior and identities. See my old video talking about those studies in detail if you want to know more. And hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's not the original source, but I put more effort into sourcing Crowder's claim than he did, so you can't exactly blame me. Oh, except for, this is something I didn't catch until I was editing. He says that some studies say as low as 0%, and he's almost definitely referring to these 2 studies from Cantor's list. So yeah, this is almost definitely where he got that from. For the next John Oliver point Crowder tries to address, one about how it's weird that the governor of South Dakota made keeping trans girls out of female sport the central point of her campaign ad, Crowder calmly and empirically attempts to identify a logical fallacy.
The truth is, this is what we call a reverse nirvana fallacy. Okay? It's an intellect. Let's bring up the logical fallacy alert. A lot of these are used with a bit of ad hominem thrown in. So let me read to you the reverse nirvana fallacy. It's comparing a realistic solution with an idealized one and discounting or even dismissing the realistic solution as a result of comparing it to a perfect world or impossible standard. So in this case, we also have basically, well, since it hasn't become a huge problem yet, why would you do anything about it?
A small note, he says the reverse nirvana fallacy, but since that's not a thing, he couldn't find a formal definition of it and has to imagine what the reverse of the nirvana fallacy would be, which I don't think would be what he says it is. He relies on the story of 2 runners in Connecticut, Fallon Fox, Leah Thomas, Veronica Ivy, and Laurel Hubbard as evidence that trans girls competing with cis girls will eventually destroy female sports, hence his support for the Save Women's Sports bills. But, as Stephen points out, just as something not being a problem now doesn't mean it will never be a problem, 6 trans women across 5 different sports in 3 different countries occasionally winning is not evidence that trans women will eventually dominate the entirety of female sport. For the sake of brevity, this is the last time I'll address trans women in sport for this video. Please see my magnum opus on the topic for more details. I can promise you that my video contains exactly 0 weird tangents about white women.
Now, it doesn't affect largely white women, so white women don't really care about it, because many white women don't compete in sports.
The next point Crowder tries to debunk is, well, it's hard to read this as anything other than Crowder defending the act of lying about drag queens.
They want to accuse you of doing what it is that they're doing. So right here, John Oliver, here's another claim. He takes issue with Republicans renaming things to make them sound like exactly what they are.
Branding the discussion of trans issues under the umbrella of radical gender theory. And he tweeted out that conservatives should start using the phrase trans stripper in lieu of drag queen. It has a more lurid set of connotations and shifts the debate to sexualization.
Okay, so a couple things. Here's the truth. Again, they're gaslighting you by changing language. This is what they do.
Let's do a quick recap. John Oliver simply reads a real tweet by Chris Rufo explicitly encouraging Republicans to lie about what drag queens do. And Crowder responds with, and this is with a big graphic that says truth in front of him, they're gaslighting you by changing language. This is what they do. Is Chris Rufo part of them now? Is there a word for when you see something happen, then someone tries to convince you that something else entirely has happened? Let's assume you already know that drag queens and trans women, while there can be some overlap, are not the same thing. Beyond that, strippers, including trans strippers, strip, as in they take off their clothes. Drag queens put on clothes, often a lot of clothes, often, I'll say it, too many clothes. And without a amount of rhinestones and feathers, taking those clothes off at the end of the day requires several hours and a dedicated team of professionals. Cool, next claim, and here we have just a little bit of hope, the teeniest justification for debunking Stevenson Crowder with facts and logic. John Oliver is about to point out that the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria is based on a shit study. And it is a very shit study. Here's the video I did on it. It was so shit that Crowder has to admit this.
So John Oliver goes on to cite one, and from what I understand, albeit flawed study about the role of peer pressure increasing the rates of, sort of childhood transitioning.
We got him. Even the biggest right-wing grifter hack isn't able to pretend that this study proves what he wants it to prove. That spark of joy is short-lived, however, because he pulls the exact same gaslighting nonsense about how making up a new term for something that doesn't exist is something they do, or we do, or whatever. Yeah, he's a hypocrite and it's already boring, but the truth, according to Crowder, is that there's actually study after study after study after study showing ROGD is a real thing.
And the only example pointing out this might be a problem is this one flawed study. No, it's not only study after study after study after study.
And his proof of that is...
Here's the truth. It's not just one study that exists as far as this new phenomenon of children transitioning at record rates. You've seen a dramatic increase in surgeries. The sex reassignment market in the United States right now is valued at $1.9 billion in the United States alone.
One market report predicting an increase in surgeries for trans adults that once again is not sourced in the description and is simply credited to source. To be clear, yes, the rate of both trans identification among young people as well as the clinical diagnoses of gender dysphoria have gone up markedly in the past few years. However, and apparently this has to be said, showing that a number has gone up is not the same thing as explaining why a number has gone up. I'm going to play the full inoculation Crowder gave at this point now because it's funnier now that we have context.
So another claim that he makes is, and what they try and do is take one example and say, this is your entire argument. So John Oliver goes on to cite one, and from what I understand, albeit flawed study about the role of peer pressure increasing the rates of, sort of childhood transitioning, but tries to make it seem as though that's the only study or the only empirical evidence that we have, even though it's not true, but this is how he presents it.
Well, Stephen and co-hosts, it sure does look like your entire argument that kids only identify as trans because it's a trendy fad actually did rest on one study, because when given the opportunity, you could not produce another one. Okay, at this point in the video, we're going to do a bit of a tonal shift, both because of some of the more serious topics, as well as the callous and dangerously irresponsible way Crowder talks about them. So, content warning here, you can skip to the timecode on screen. Here's what John Oliver says next, and how Crowder responds.
And to the extent that some young people are just exploring their gender identity, how exactly is that a bad thing? Who the f*** are they hurting?
Themselves? So let's go through this point by point statistically. Here's the truth. Attempted suicide rate for transgender individuals is somewhere around 40%. Okay? And by the way, doesn't get much better pre or post-op. It's always between about 40 to 42% based on the data that we have.
Crowder then says that the attempted suicide rate for trans individuals is around 40%, and it doesn't get much better pre or post-op. As evidence of this, he brings up a study from the American Academy of Pediatrics on transgender adolescent suicide behavior. It's not highlighted on screen here, but averaging out the three categories of trans teenagers does show an attempted suicide rate of about 40%. Two things to note about this. One, Crowder and his ilk will take the numbers they want from studies like this and ignore any conflicting interpretations from the researchers who actually collected them. He wants his audience to think that identifying as trans is the thing that increases suicidal ideation, and that parents, school officials, and talk show hosts who peddle trans ideology are complicit. The researchers of this study, on the other hand, say that minority identities themselves are not the cause of health disparities, and that family acceptance and support are associated with diminished disparities in depression between trans and cis children. Two, This study is not where Crowder got his 40% statistic from. I know that's a bold claim considering the source he put up seems to support at least half of it, but it's that other half of his claim that gives it away. The notion that the statistic doesn't change whether or not they transition. If you followed the trans issue at all for the past few years, you've almost certainly heard that talking point verbatim. 40% followed by whether or not they transition. This talking point is years old at this point and comes from a misinterpretation of a 2014 Williams Institute survey on transgender people that did find that their full sample had an attempted lifetime suicide rate of 41%, and that this number is the same or even higher among individuals who have received some sort of gender affirmative care. This is where Crowder and others have gotten that second point from, that the number doesn't change with transition. However, as I've pointed out before, this is so wrong as to be a lie. The survey asked one question: have you ever attempted suicide, yes or no? And there were no follow-up questions regarding age or transgender/gender nonconforming status at the time of the attempt. Meaning, if someone's gender dysphoria was so severe that they attempted suicide, then, because people with severe gender dysphoria are more likely to seek and qualify for medical transition, they get that treatment and improve immensely. They still show up as a yes on the survey because the question was about lifetime attempts. Crowder knew the talking point first and then looked for any study to give the appearance of empirical evidence for it, even if that study did not support the second and arguably more important part of his claim. Oh, and wouldn't you know it, the source Crowder used suffers from the exact same methodological flaw. But, to be fair to the guys who make jokes and laugh about trans suicides,
who are they hurting? Well, there's an answer for you.
That's good if you see a therapist and he just flips a coin.
Right, yes, exactly. I shouldn't have gone to therapist Two-Face.
Well, looks like you're going to be prepay.
Yes.
they do have another source. And if you're familiar with the Williams Institute survey, you'll be familiar with this one too.
And yeah, post-op transgenders still also, to give you scope, 19 times more likely to commit suicide than the general population. Post-op transgenders, 19 times more likely. All the references. Post-op.
Got everything you want, 19
Got everything you want.
If you watch any transphobic video, news story, or bill testimony, there is a very good chance you'll see the Sweden study. It's their workhorse, their silver bullet, now that their other bullet turned out to be a misshapen pebble that stopped up the barrel and blew back in their face. I've talked about the Sweden study before, and I will again in this video shortly, but for a new spin on things, let's skip ahead to an attempt at criticism of John Oliver by Crowder's co-host.
John, you're quoting something from 2018, from October 1st. Do we not have any data between October 1st, 2018 and what is today, October 17th,
yes.
2020? That's over 4 years, John.
They're talking about a statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics from 2018, which apparently is too old for a source to be valid in their eyes. So let's check the publication date for the Sweden study. 2011. 4 years is out of date, but 11 years? Apparently, that's still current information, and you can definitely use it to describe something happening in 2022 because nothing has changed in the battle for trans rights since Rebecca Black released Friday. Except it's not really 11 years old because the data in that study only goes up to 2003. One of the reasons conservatives love this study is because it comes from Sweden, and Sweden is relatively supportive of LGBT rights. But even if that's true, 2003 is 6 years before Sweden legalized gay marriage, so it's hard to argue with a straight face that the culture in Sweden was just as supportive then as they are today, something the study itself points out by discussing how altered societal attitudes affected their data. And they talk about altered societal attitudes because the data wasn't collected in 2003, it was collected from 1973 to 2003, meaning the bulk of the data supporting that 19 times number is from the 70s and 80s. The authors state that the overall mortality rate was only significantly increased for the group operated before 1989, which could be due to a longer follow-up period, but might also be explained by improved healthcare for trans people and more favorable societal views toward gender nonconforming people as time went on. Finally, this collection of old data from a different country only compared trans people post-gender reassignment surgery to cis people matched for their birth sex. It says nothing about the efficacy of surgery for alleviating stress or depression because it wasn't designed to do that. The authors say the results should not be interpreted such as sex reassignment per se increases morbidity and mortality. Things might have been even worse without sex reassignment. For an analogy, people with depression are going to have far higher rates of suicide than people without it, but it wouldn't then follow that treatments for depression are the culprit. The lead author of this study, by the way, was also the lead author of a literature review of 38 studies published 5 years later, which found that although the levels of psychopathology and psychiatric disorders in trans people attending services at the time of assessment are higher than in the cis population, they do improve following gender-confirming medical intervention, in many cases reaching normative values. Next, Crowder talks about the risk of puberty blockers for children, citing an FDA report which identified 6 cases of a type of brain swelling in kids aged between 5 and 12 who were taking puberty blockers.
Which brings us to another truth. Per the FDA, by the way, puberty blockers can cause brain swelling, vision loss, other kinds of psychiatric issues.
We shouldn't dismiss that risk. All medication carries some form of risk, and it's an important part of informed consent. However, the fact that the kids were as young as 5 should raise an eyebrow. That's way too young for it to be a trans kid starting medical treatment. Crowder is associating puberty blockers with trans kids, but only 1 of those 6 kids was taking them as a part of gender-affirming care. The other 5 were being treated for central precocious puberty, a condition in which the body matures far sooner than expected. Crowder does not mention this, because if his audience found out that this medication is and has been used to treat children for something other than gender dysphoria for decades, it would be a lot harder to pretend that these drugs are experimental or dangerous to kids. Precocious puberty and gender dysphoria are, of course, not the same thing. But it's the same medicine in both cases, and the desired physiological effects are the same, to halt or slow the progression of puberty, so if they truly believed this treatment was dangerous to children, they'd have to be against its use in cases other than trans kids. Moving on, to try and make the point that hormone replacement therapy for trans people could cause cancer, Crowder puts up a collage of sources to support his claim that excess estrogen in the body is believed to be cancerous.
Here's another truth. Excess estrogen in the body is, of course, believed to be cancerous. Now, I cannot say definitively 100%, just to be clear on YouTube, that injecting a boy with estrogen or altering his hormone levels might actually prove to be cancerogenic.
Despite the fact that he puts up the collage for less than 5 seconds, we can already see a glaring flaw in the argument he's attempting to make. Only one of those sources actually mentions the human hormone estrogen, specifically 17-beta estradiol, the hormone naturally produced in the ovaries and the one most commonly given to trans women as a part of hormone replacement therapy. Now, 17-beta estradiol is an important factor in the initiation and progression of breast cancer, and trans women on HRT should get regular breast exams just like cis women, especially if they have a family history. But that study also talks about xenoestrogens, and the other 2 sources Crowder puts up on screen are only about xenoestrogens. Specifically, all 3 of these sources talk about a xenoestrogen called bisphenol A, or BPA, an industrial chemical that's used to make plastics. These studies do show that BPA might be linked to several negative health outcomes, including prostate and breast cancer, which is why you might have heard about BPA if you've bought a water bottle or something that's advertised itself as BPA-free. However, BPA is, to put it simply, a different fucking chemical than either the estrogen produced in all bodies naturally or the estrogen prescribed as part of HRT. That's why it's called a xenoestrogen and not just estrogen, and why they had to be studied separately. 2 of these 3 sources are not about the thing being claimed. Crowder and company confused human hormones with the stuff they used to use to make Tupperware. Okay, remember how Crowder inoculated his audience by pretending that they can only appeal to emotion? Well, consider this line a twofer.
When injected directly into the thigh of a 7-year-old, however, we don't have the long-term studies. Therefore, let's make it the Wild West.
Obviously, this is an emotional appeal designed to spark outrage, which is why I think a charitable reading would assume that he's not literally telling his audience they're injecting 7-year-olds with hormones. But that charitable reading would be wrong. He does want his audience to think that, and we are so close to my proof. Before we get there, though, we have one more John Oliver point to get through. Here's how Crowder and crew respond to the clips of children testifying in favor of trans rights.
All right. Let's go on to the next claim. Sorry, there's so much here, but all the references are available. I think this is more important than taxes. They're trying to, let's just show his next claim.
Notably, young people are showing up in public forums where adults are fear-mongering about letting trans kids into youth sports and bathrooms and trying to talk some sense into them.
I will not let a board full of people who barely represent me tell me who I am and what I can do. Grow up and fix your behavior.
The leader of the My Chemical Romance fan club?
I'm not worried about a trans person harassing me. I'm worried about if I'm going to fail Spanish in my next class.
You will.
I have used these bathrooms repeatedly alongside trans people and have never once felt threatened.
These are grown men, everybody. He responds further.
You're fear-mongering. Here are some anecdotal examples of
Right.
largely white women who don't care, who don't compete in sports, who don't really have a dog in this fight.
More weird comments about white women and then decrying them, favoring the anecdotal over the empirical, before admittedly using anecdotes to further his point, including a story about a trans girl sexually assaulting someone in a middle school bathroom that turned out to be an almost certainly fabricated rumor, and a transphobic court testimony from an almost identical looking white girl to the one he just played a fart sound over that he describes unironically like this.
It is embarrassing enough for a girl to change a pad knowing all the other girls can hear the crinkle of the packaging. But telling her that she must be okay doing it in the presence of boys because their preferred pronouns are she, her? How evil can you be?
Now, notice even the difference in the way that the children who lean right and the children who lean left argue. She doesn't just to appeal to emotion, she says biologically they are the same. That is correct.
Here's why I think it's useless to try and accuse Steven Crowder of hypocrisy. He's not falling into rhetorical traps or accidentally contradicting himself. He sets the show up like this. If you know you're about to use some dishonest, fear-mongering, bullshit rhetorical tactics, all you have to do is accuse your enemies of doing it first, and then you can frame it as beating them at their own game. Yeah, I'm punching this dude in the dick, but that's the kind of thing they do, and I'm forced to fight back. His audience is already hyper-partisan, and they don't go to Steven Crowder to learn, they go for pep talks. This is why Crowder thinks he can get away, and probably did get away, with the stupidest attempt at a dunk I've ever seen in my life. And look how excited he is that he thinks he's caught John out on a lie.
So I'll just roll this and then roll the clip right after. That children, don't worry, children are not eligible for any kind of medical intervention.
But to hear some tell it, as soon as a child declares themselves trans, there is an immediate, irreversible surgical decision undertaken, and there just isn't. So let's break down exactly what gender-affirming care consists of. To be very clear, prepubescent children are not eligible for medical interventions.
And then immediately goes into talking about medical intervention and advocating for it on a legislative level. This is what happens right after that clip.
At the onset of puberty, an adolescent and their family might consider puberty blockers. The next potential medical intervention is usually hormone therapy, which boosts levels of testosterone or estrogen. Opponents of gender-affirming care make a lot of alarmist claims.
Would I be insulting your intelligence if I pointed out what was wrong with what Crowder tried to do? John Oliver says correctly that prepubescent children are not eligible for medical intervention, and then he apparently refutes himself by saying that at the onset of puberty, puberty blockers might be considered. Then, while John is explaining that the next step, well into their teenage years, would be hormone therapy, Crowder shouts, "I thought they didn't exist!" There is a reason that Crowder has been sprinkling in these remarks about 6-year-olds getting their penises chopped off or 7-year-olds getting injected with estrogen. There's a reason he responds to that clip with this.
He acknowledges that there doesn't give you the actual severity of it. Right, he says, experimental, which it's not. Hold on a second. Birth control isn't considered experimental. Is it for 9-year-olds?
I agree with the adage that you shouldn't attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity. There is no fucking way that no one on Crowder's entire team knows what prepubescent means. There is no way they think 6-year-olds are getting genital surgery. This is an intentional effort to get his audience to associate the most extreme treatments they can imagine with the youngest possible children. He's so confident in his ability to do that, he'll put John Oliver up on screen saying one thing, knowing that he can spin it to mean the opposite. Okay, we're at the point in Crowder's stream where, like anyone who's tried to cram for an oral presentation the night before, he started to run out of material. He and his co-hosts start to repeat themselves, bringing up the same 40% statistic and the Sweden study over and over, the same point about how we shouldn't let kids eat whatever they want, and that's the same as parents and doctors making medical decisions with them. They're gaslighting you, and they're narcissists, and they're just like Amber Heard and Meghan Markle for some reason, and the whole point-by-point rebuttal starts to somehow get even sloppier. Here's his next rebuttal.
Let's go on to another claim from him. This is another thing where it's just, again, an appeal to emotional fallacy, where he says, no kids are just casually dropping in to get surgery, you bigot.
Some teens may be eligible, for instance, for top surgery or chest masculinization.
I thought none of them were. Medical intervention. What happened?
Yeah, he's still going on about that. Bless his heart.
Is that pretty rare? It, like all of this, would only happen after a team of medical professionals discussed all of its risks and benefits with their patient and their patient's parent or guardian, all of whom would have to sign off. No kid is casually dropping into an operating room because they just decided to get their uterus removed with the impulsive recklessness normally associated with getting bangs.
Yeah, a board of medical professionals. Like this?
That's a huge bitch!
I think that speaks for itself. But I do have to point out my favorite part. He says a board of directors like this, but since a board has multiple people on it, he just used 2 pictures of the same woman. There is obviously more bullshit in just this video to cover, like how he tries to scare his audience by saying that the government wants to take over healthcare for your kid, while encouraging that exact thing happening to supportive parents of trans kids. But to go on would be just repeating myself, so I'll repeat myself one last time to recap. He inoculates his audience hard before everything John Oliver says to reduce the risk they'll consider what he's saying. He accuses them of doing the thing he's about to do so that whatever slimy rhetoric he uses is justified as punching back. He adopts the aesthetic of empiricism so that his emotional appeals seem like righteous indignation rather than the pathetic mewling of his enemies. Despite all of that, despite what I've been doing this entire video, I don't think fact-checking Steven Crowder or even calling attention to his rhetorical tactics is the best way to respond to him. The main sources Crowder used in this video over and over, and the ones he used to promote his response on Twitter, the 40% stat, the Sweden study, the desistance rates, are the same ones I dissected in the second video I ever did way back in April of 2019. I've done this, I'm going off script here. I know I've mentioned that video a lot in a lot of the videos that I've made, but it keeps being relevant. People keep citing the same couple of sources, and they keep citing them incorrectly. And I don't want to keep bringing up old work I did that was objectively worse somehow, but it keeps being relevant. And why haven't I uploaded? There's nothing to scientifically respond to anymore. Okay, I'm back on script. They are not being fueled by new research. They're being fueled by a frenzied media machine stoking an old visceral disgust and panic against queer people. And John Oliver was right if the trans debate is just about suicide statistics and social stigma and medical treatments. We're fighting on their home turf, playing defense for why being trans is not a sickness. Every study they cite about trans rates of suicidality or depression talks about how to better support and affirm their identities. But Crowder and those like him always ignore that because now they have a number to show that there's just something intrinsically wrong with being trans. You know what they don't respond well to? Trans joy. Anytime a trans kid was shown to be happy during John Oliver's segment, Crowder and co could only respond by saying, well, they won't be happy for long, or making fun of their appearance, or playing fart noises. He even has a moment of realization toward the end of his video where, after trying desperately not to repeat himself for the 5th time by saying that letting your kids be trans is like letting them eat whatever they want, he tries to up the stakes a bit.
Does it mean that you don't love your son or your daughter if they suffer from some kind of serious condition that maybe they need to be institutionalized for? Does it mean you don't love your son if your son becomes addicted, develops a chemical dependency, and you send them to rehab? He's going to be mad at you. He feels good doing it in that moment. And you're going to say, are you comparing trans people to drug addicts? No, I'm not comparing them to drug addicts, but certainly we are talking about exogenous hormones. We are talking about medical intervention, often drugs.
He was comparing trans kids to drug addicts, and he knew that comparing kids to drug addicts was not a good look, even for his audience, and he tried to walk it back. Seeing happy trans kids breaks his brain, and he forgets that he's supposed to be pretending to be motivated by something virtuous, and it reveals that there's nothing behind the curtain beyond disgust and fear. He can lie about numbers and he can talk about the soul of the nation or whatever, but when he runs out of pre-prepared talking points, he defaults to the man he is. A man terrified of the notion that the people he despises are leading happy lives.